Hotel. Welcome to Journey of Self. I'm your host, Sarah. Tonight's show is basically a reflection on current events that have occurred since we last went live. There's a number of things that have been going on that are of significance. And there are some things that are unfolding that are connected to things that we've talked about in our series on Trump insider or establishment. So we'll continue to explore some of those connections and their significance and tie them back to basically work that Steve Coakley has started in identifying and naming the names of those who are primarily behind controlling what unfolds on the world stage. So we'll go into that. We'll start by going through some recent events and some engage in some discussion over that. And then we're going to talk about the need for us to be grounded spiritually in order to be able to effectively navigate what's going on in the human drama. Because as things unfold, it's going to be more and more important for us to be able to be spiritually grounded so that we don't get caught up in the things that are going on. And there's a lot of things going on. Um, we have AI, we have the wars that are ensuing. We're, I believe, on the cusp of a significant economic downturn when it actually hits. Um, so, again, those are going to require us to be very spiritually grounded, and for Black people, I believe it will require us to be more united, and that is, I believe, also one of the reasons why so much effort is continually put into place in order to keep us distracted and to keep us from uniting together. And that operates on so many different fronts. The current gender war, if you will, between Black men and Black women, which I do believe is an extension of the COINTELPRO program to destabilize the Black community using a number of different weapons that are in their arsenal. Um, and we do know that the intelligence community makes great use of social media to influence behavior. So that'll be a topic we'll pick up again. But so let's go into some of the current events. And engage in some discussion over those things. it is my practice to do, through as I notice things of significance, I'll post them on my Facebook page so that we can come back to them when we do the show. So, as many of you are aware, the President Trump had come up with a program to take taxpayer dollars to fund to create a fund to compensate Trump allies who were prosecuted for their criminal activities in support of Trump. And that was in exchange for the IRS dropping its investigations into its finances. Fortunately, that has been deemed illegal by the courts. But it really speaks to a disregard for ethics and a theme, an overall theme of corruption, and an attitude of feeling above the law, above reproach. So it says here, the Trump administration announced Monday the creation of a nearly $1.8 billion fund to compensate allies of the Republican president who believe that they have been unjustly investigated and prosecuted. Arrangements that Democrats and government watchdogs derided as corrupt and unconstitutional. That contention has been upheld by the courts, but it just really shows how blatant politicians have become in terms of just being unethical. And of course, ethics is not something that you could use to describe Trump. Here we see an article where the media is trying to stir up fear, and we've talked about the fact that fear is a popular tool to be able to manipulate and control people, because when people are in fear, they're much more easily manipulated because people don't think clearly when they're in fear. And so the agent used to put people in a fearful state is the threat of Ebola, and then there was some other potential pandemic on some virus that was being warned about. Now, here I alluded to the fact that the economy is on unstable footing. So here's an article that discusses that, if I can access it. Looks like I'm not going to be able to share this, but I do have access to it on my phone. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. Here we see statement from President Trump, who's threatening an attack on Iran, uh, trying to pressure them into capitulating on a deal. The Iranian government has been attacking some of the neighbors, the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Now, the significance of these attacks is that with Iran attacking those Middle Eastern, if you will, allies of the United States, the motivation for these countries to be allies of the United States is the promise of protection from the United States. But as these countries have been the subject of attacks by Iran, the specter of the United States providing protection in exchange for their alliance, in exchange for providing access to oil, in exchange for continuing to use the dollar as a primary medium of exchange, is now in jeopardy. So you see, Trump says, I've been asked by the Emir of Qatar, Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, and the President of the United Arab Emirates, to hold off on the planned military attack of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was scheduled for tomorrow. And the serious negotiations are now taking place. And that, in their opinion, as great leaders and allies, a deal will be made. This will be fairly acceptable to the United States of America as well as countries in the Middle East and beyond. And so he says he's going to delay the attack. So, again, my point on posting his comment is that there's heightened concern that plans to reduce or replace the dollar as the world's currency, and particularly from the aforementioned oil-producing countries that he mentioned in his post on his website, that those countries no longer have an incentive to use the petrodollar because their incentive was the implied military protection by the United States. Now that you see that Iran has been attacking them, it is apparent to them that there is no protection, and so there is no motivation for them to continue to operate as allies, and there's a real threat that they could withdraw their support for the dollar as the primary means of exchange for oil purchases. That is significant in that is what is basically holding up the value of the dollar, because intrinsically the dollar is not worth what the value shows on the world market, because of the fact that over the past 20 or so years since the Great Recession, the Federal Reserve has significantly increased the money supply through the response to to the recession, um, to the money that was pumped in as a result of the pandemic. And so, with the flood of dollars into the economy, that has ended up reducing the value of the dollar because with more dollars in circulation, the value of the dollar goes down, which is why there's a significant amount of inflation right now. So, what inflation really means is that the dollar does not purchase as much as it used to. And so, the prices of goods relative to the value of the dollar is going up. So, it's not so much that the cost of the goods is uh, has increased, which is another thing because actually they have um, because of the increase in oil prices. And so it's twofold. The value of the dollar has gone down because of the fact that there is more money in circulation. So the dollar relative to the goods um, has gone down. Thus, the dollar doesn't have the same purchasing power. Then, secondly, because of the war that's going on, goods have become more expensive, even if only because of the fact that it's more expensive to transport them. Never mind whether the production of the goods involves um, the use of oil. Okay, and this one article I found, which is related to the pandemic. Professor Francis Doyle had agreed to testify against Bill Gates and Pfizer over the risks that were inherent in the COVID-19 vaccine, that mRNA vaccines that they developed, was mysteriously found dead um, days after he agreed to testify. And here the article goes on to say that this is from the Insight Hub, published on May 15th of this year. Sudden and mysterious death of Professor Francis Boyle has taken the world by surprise. Just days before his untimely passing, Boyle has agreed to testify against Bill Gates and the CEO of Pfizer, raising serious concerns about the risk of the COVID-19 vaccine. Known for his work in law and human rights, Boyle's involvement in these high-profile allegations had the potential to reveal uncomfortable truths about the global response to the pandemic. Professor Boyle had been vocal about his stance on the vaccine safety and had long questioned the role of the big pharmaceutical companies and influential figures in public health decisions. His death has sparked widespread speculation and has only fueled further distrust in the corporate and political entities involved. As investigations into his sudden demise unfold, many are left wondering if his death was an unfortunate coincidence or something far more sinister. This tragic event has added to the growing tension surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine debacle or debate, particularly regarding the potential conflicts of interest between major pharmaceutical companies and political leaders such as Anthony Fauci. Boyle's untimely departure has left many unanswered questions, and as more details emerge, the public is demanding answers. The world waits for clarity, hoping that the truth behind his death will ultimately be revealed. Here, I came upon this where it says, and I'll look to find information to verify this, but I do remember reading this some time ago. But in 1974, Henry Kissinger recommended homosexuality for the population control in the black community. And unfortunately, we do see homosexuality running rampant within the black community. Um, so this should not be a surprise to us. And as I pointed out, I believe that the current gender war that's going on between black men and black women is also an intelligence manipulated conflict for the same purpose, not just to undermine the community, but for population control amongst black people. This I found disturbing. The Midas Touch pointed out that this now former 60 Minutes news correspondent was, don't know if I want to say dismissed, but she was relieved of her job um, by allowing her contract to expire because of her focus on a news story that she was working on, and that CBS wanted to censor. It was a story that she was working on 60 Minutes, and CBS wanted to censor it. Now, that's a significant issue in that 60 Minutes or any major television news outlet would find themselves in a position where they need to censor their own reporters, because we know that corporate media has long been compromised and cannot be relied on as a source of information. We know that, from our study of media, that it is controlled and coordinated. So the likelihood that you can find truth in corporate media is already remote. So it's a significant moment when one of their reporters is dismissed for trying to shed some truth on things that are going on in the political realm. So here it says, and this is from the Midas Touch on May 27th. It says, now former 60 Minutes correspondent Sharon Alfonsi goes scorched earth on Barry Weiss after CBS declined to renew the veteran correspondent's contract just 6 months after her 60 Minutes segment on the alleged torture of Venezuelan migrants was abruptly pulled before airing. Over the weekend, my contract with CBS News expired, drawn to a close nearly 20 years with the network, including more than a decade of 60 Minutes. Following an intense editorial dispute over a Seacott story, repeated attempts by my representation to establish a path forward were met with absolute silence from network executives. The message could not be clearer. My time at 60 Minutes is apparently over. In the coming days, network leadership may attempt to hide behind corporate euphemisms such as modernization and restructuring to explain away my departure. She says, don't be misled. This is not a routine corporate transition. It was a deliberate choice to penalize a journalist for refusing to sanitize factually accurate reporting and sends a chilling message to the entire newsroom. Fearless independent reporting has always been a defining standard at 60 Minutes, she says. Today, CBS management is abandoning this mission. Choosing access journalism over accountability and protecting power rather than scrutinizing it. When she says access journalism is that uh, instead of investigating politicians and politics and power, they prefer to be able to have access to those uh, the powerful people within the political realm rather than pursuing the truth, pursuing legitimate news stories to really pull the curtain behind what's really going on, and to really, inform the public, which is what the purpose of the media is supposed to be. So she goes on to say, um, this wall between editorial independence and corporate interests at CBS is being methodically torn down. Journalists willing to challenge authority are being pushed aside in favor of those who will not. If this continues, the result will be a broadcast that looks like 60 Minutes, but lacks the courage and character to produce journalism that matters. To my colleagues who became family working beside you has been a privilege of a lifetime. You're second to none. I've learned exactly what it costs to hold the line. Right now, I hold it anyway. Viewers and the people who trust us and their stories deserve nothing less. Now, this again is a significant moment in that we're seeing the news become more and more as an arm of propaganda, where it is only an extension of the political power structure or whoever happens to be in power. Um, it's just an, ex, an extension of the government. Um, the press was held up traditionally to be a check on power, um, and now we see that that is no longer the case in this country. So there's not much now, as things unfold in this manner, to distinguish us from um, other, I guess, fascist type of governments. So there's really more of an illusion of freedom as um, many of the things that have been characteristic of the freedoms in this country are being slowly eradicated. And we see Netanyahu up to his normal um, brutality, ordering the Israeli army to seize 70% of the Gaza Strip, violating the ceasefire deal. Let's see if we'll have the ability to read this one. He's basically saying that we're in a situation where we must crush Hezbollah, and that's his rationale for basically taking control of the Gaza Strip, which is not actually true. Um, that's what they plan to do. Anyhow, um, Hezbollah does not pose a significant threat. It's really just a cover for being able to take the, more land from the Palestinians. Netanyahu says he's giving orders to the Israeli army to seize control of 70% of Gaza Strip in a move that threatens to torpedo an already fragile ceasefire and create catastrophic humanitarian conditions in the already devastated territory. Under the U.S. brokered ceasefire in October, the Israeli army withdrew to a demarcation line which gave Israel direct control of 50% of the occupied territory. Since then, Israeli forces have steadily advanced their positions westward into Hamas controlled half of the strip and declared an ever expanded no man's land west of that. Within rights, they claim right to decide who can enter and open fire on anyone perceived as a threat. In recent days, Israeli backed armed militia have taken a leading role in emptying the territory along the ceasefire line, telling residents to vacate their homes and shelters. Throughout the 8 months of the ceasefire, Israeli forces have continued to open fire on Palestinians within range of the Yellow Line, splitting the strip and carrying out airstrikes deeper within Gaza, killing more than 900 Palestinians since the truce began. And then we've seen after the Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering is essentially legal, that the Republicans have moved quickly um, after actually the Supreme Court voted to eradicate more of the protections from the Voting Rights Act, which gave the ability for um, gerrymandering of the district. So it's basically allowing district maps to be redrawn to be in favor of the political party that happens to be in power, which in this case are the Republicans. So now the point that I made in posting this was that all of this could have been avoided if Barack Obama had been acting in the interests of black people, or even um, the dictates of his own party, if anyone is to believe that there's any distinction between the parties. And so here I said the gerrymandering situation that is going on, and the thing that allowed it, the Supreme Court ruling that ended up allowing that, I'm placing squarely at the feet of Obama, because when Obama was in his first term, the Democrats had both the House of Representatives and the Senate under control. And so, with that being the case, Obama should have appointed at least 2 Supreme Court justices, if not 3, which would have forestalled the very thing that has happened right now with the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act. And I have argued that the continued dismantling of civil rights protections that have been long fought for by civil rights activists since the early or late 50s and early 60s have been slowly and more, I think probably I'll say there's been escalation in pulling and eradicating all those uh, civil rights uh, gains that were fought for and won during the 60s have been eradicated more rapidly, particularly during the Obama administration. And by having him as president, it made it easier for those type of decisions to be made because they would not be questioned while by black people with a black president in power. So essentially, they were able to eradicate the civil rights gains by having a black man in the presidency because black people wouldn't pay attention and hold him accountable to it because just because of the fact that black people were euphoric over the fact that they had a black president. Okay, so in my opinion, you couldn't have Trump without Obama, and it's all part of the same plan to be able to consolidate world control. Here you see more signs about the weakening of the economy. People are becoming more and more absorbed in debt. You having to use their credit cards to make ends meet because Americans are falling behind their $1.2 trillion credit card bill. Um, as people begin defaulting on those credit cards, that will create a domino effect that will contribute to the significant economic downturn that looms on the horizon. Here you see an Israeli man was recently arrested at a Cyprus airport with four human embryos in cryogenic containers labeled life parcel. Let's see if this will play. Unfortunately, I can't play that one. Anyway, so I want to move to a different article here. Okay, actually, this is from the book "One Nation Under Blackmail" by Whitney Webb, and I want to begin kind of like going into this book here because what she does is she establishes the links between the United States intelligence community, the so-called elites um, throughout the world, and the connections between them and the organized crime. On top of that is also the significance of who is involved in the organized crime, and the fact that they do not fit the movie characterization of who the individuals who were the primary mobsters, if you will, or the face of organized crime. In other words, the organized crime is not what we typically see in the movies as being Italian, Sicilian, and so forth. The most powerful of the organized crime figures have never been highlighted in any Hollywood movies because the people who control the movie industry are of the same heritage as those who were the primary power brokers in organized crime. And those would be the Ashkenazic Jewish descendants. Okay, so we'll refer to them as Ashkenazic uh, descendants for purposes of this article. And so as you go into these things, you see that many of the people who are considered to be the lead power brokers in terms of the corporate world, who um, make decisions on policy, who are making decisions uh, from an economic standpoint, who are making decisions from the in media, who are making policy decisions, who are making decisions on wars, uh, who are making decisions on how the nation's budget is spent. These are all connected. They're essentially the same people. So, what Whitney Webb does brilliantly is show who these people are, um, which supports the research that Brother Steve Copley had done, where he identified the Anglo Zionist plans to control world affairs. Okay, so when we say the Ashkenazi Zionists, we're talking about the same people. Okay, so there are, and we have established deep connections between the organized crime, the intelligence community, some key figures in the corporate world. But she's going to go into, I guess, a really deep background and origin story, and basically show how uh, those people who are currently in control, how they consolidated their power, how they accumulated their wealth, and how they have basically legitimized their their money through laundering it through financial institutions um, to basically consolidate and increase their wealth. Okay, so in chapter one of her book, titled "The Underworld," the spies and crooks. She describes a fire that broke out on this ship called the Normandy in New York City's harbor. And she says, in the wake of that fire, um, they initiated a salvage operation. They found that they couldn't repair the ship, and they scrapped the ship in 1946. But when they investigated the destruction of the ship, they found that the cause of the disaster was incompetence and carelessness. But there was a rumor that it was more to it than just incompetence. And so the rumors were that Germans had um, sabotaged the ship with the intent on disrupting America's early war efforts, and they argued that their intent was to break down the country's logistical capabilities through attacks on ports and harbors and factories in order to gain a strategic advantage over the United States. Says William B. Hurlins, then the New York Commissioner of Investigation, summed up the spirit of the times when he said, "We are faced with a grave national emergency. A blackout was imposed over the waterfront within the 3rd Naval District, which included New York and New Jersey. Many of our ships were being sunk by enemy submarines off the Atlantic coast, and the outcome of the war hung in the balance." And this will be um, based on the time. It would have been around World War II. Management and regulation of these critical harbors and coastlines was the responsibility of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now, the Office of Naval Intelligence is significant um, because the Office of Naval Intelligence, is significant to us in the Black community because it was the Office of Naval Intelligence that Joel Spingarn belonged to, who was one of the main founders of the NAACP, which was founded to monitor Black people, monitor racial tensions. So it was basically an opportunity to spy on the Black community. So it says the Office of Naval Intelligence Inquiry was opened on May 1942, and the potential saboteurs and Nazi agents operating in the ports and possibility of U-boat movements off the East Coast. The man tasked with overseeing this inquiry was C. Radcliffe Haffenden. Several of the agents assigned to work under Haffenden had previously worked with Thomas E. Dewey, the U.S. state attorney who later served as governor of New York. Dewey was best known for his prosecution of organized crime, and through these contacts, Haffenden learned of the role played by gangsters and other criminal elements on the New York City waterfront. Dewey's chief of staff, Attorney Frank Hogan, suggested to Haffenden and the ONI that they speak with a man named Joseph Joe Sox Lanza. Lanza was officially a business agent for the United Seafood Workers Union. He was also a mobster in his own right and was known as the rackets boss of the Fulton Fish Market in downtown New York City. Yet compared to the stature of the criminal figures in the city, Lanza was a small fry and he knew it. As a result, he would end up telling ONI that they would have better luck higher up the food chain. He suggested either Meyer Lansky, who controlled the Longshoremen's Union, or Frank Costello, a gambling figure with numerous interests throughout the waterfront. But to get to them, Lanza told Haffenden that he would need to first speak to Lucky Luciano. Now let's go back. He said he suggested either Meyer Lansky. So when I was alluding to the 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 media portrayal of organized crime being that of Italians, we see here that one of the more powerful members of organized crime was Meyer Lansky, who is not Italian, uh, who is Zionist or Ashkenazic descendant, and he is of significance because we talked about when we were doing our analysis into how Trump came into power. We noted that his purchase of his first casino was through this company called the Mary Carter Pink Company, of whom one of the principal shareholders was Meyer Lansky. So we see by connecting those dots that these are the people who were part of the establishment and became part of the establishment through their being able to accumulate financial power through organized crime and the connection between organized crime and intelligence, as she's demonstrating here. And through those means, through the financial power that was accumulated through these type of activities, they were able to control politics and thus put into office those people who would carry out their interests, one of whom is, of course, the current president, Donald Trump. Okay, so it goes on to say Luciano at the time was locked away in prison, having been put there by Thomas Dewey. A delicate series of negotiations were subsequently launched in what is now known as Operation Underworld. This operation, which the government was forced to reluctantly acknowledge after decades of public denials, involved the recruitment of high-level organized crime figures for work with American intelligence services justified by wartime necessity. Not long after Operation Underworld had been given the go-ahead, Luciano agreed to the ONI's request, and the prison cell soon became a hub for meetings between him and his criminal associates, meetings in which they coordinate counterintelligence activities with the Navy. Despite Operation Underworld's initial and relatively narrow objectives, the scope of the operation organically expanded. Before long, Luciano and his colleagues, Meyer Lansky, chief amongst them, helping the ONI cultivate intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Lower-ranking mob figures and immigrants were frequently brought to Hafner's offices for questioning. Names and contact figures for friendly Sicilians, many of whom were mafia figures, were provided to ONI agents for use in the military campaign. While the resulting collaborations between the mafia and the military on the beaches and the villages of Sicily have slipped into legend, the legacy of Operation Underworld has endured and undeniably forever altered the United States of America and beyond. Indeed, Operation Underworld was the beginning of the creation of a new underworld entirely, one built on the cooperation, if not outright symbiosis, between organized crime and American intelligence. Okay, she goes on to give some background of Lucky Luciano. He was born in 1897. It says at a young age he formed his own gang, which offered protection to Jewish immigrants from Italian and Irish organized crime elements in exchange for small fees. I'm going to skip ahead, but it basically says how he consolidated power and became involved in prostitution, narcotics, and organized labor. Basically, um, began control of unions, and through his criminal activities, was able to um, generate a significant amount of money. And it says that he would join with an individual named he would join with a young gangster named Frank Costello, an immigrant from Calabria, Italy. He, Luciano, and Costello ended up joining with Meyer Lansky, who we just spoke about, and also his Jewish friend, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. And it says Lansky was well connected in Jewish mob circles, and he, along with Siegel, had amassed significant wealth during the Prohibition era. Lansky's, whose long shadow was cast across the entire history of organized crime in the 20th century, was something of a visionary. Various accounts paint him as the intellectual architect behind the multi ethnic organized crime model that Luciano successfully pursued. Lansky was also instrumental in bringing mob groups into the world of gambling, helping set up casinos in the Caribbean that would be used to wash money generated by their various vices and rackets. Perhaps most importantly of all was that Lansky had also developed the use of a complex banking network, which he adopted in an effort to avoid the fate of Al Capone, who was taken down through tax evasion. Um, Bringing to light some of the things that they just talked about in terms of what crime activities, criminal activities that Meyer Lansky was involved in, points out the fact that he was instrumental in gambling. I mention that because of the bringing us to current times. We see a significant increase in proliferation of gambling activities throughout the United States. Uh, Gambling has been legalized in most of the states of the in most of the states of the country. Um, all of the major sports organizations in the country have establishes established alliances with gambling entities. When any of us watch any sporting events, there is invariably some type of advertisement associated with some type of gambling entity. Okay, so when we go back and look at the origin of gambling and see the proliferation of gambling throughout the country today and the significance of it, the adverse effect that it's having on communities, the adverse effect it's having on uh, the increase in gambling addictions, the increase in the compromising of sports outcomes. Um, we see the hidden hand behind that, who are the primary proponents of gambling when we go back and look at this historical information. Okay, and so it says perhaps more important of all was that Lansky had developed the use of a complex banking network. Now, when we talk about banking, we also know who are the primary controllers of that industry, being the same people. We know that the Rothschilds, who are also Zionist Jews, um, are the preeminent banking family throughout the world and were instrumental in setting up the Federal Reserve and central banks throughout Europe. Okay, and so you see here in this article, it draws a correlation between organized crime and banking, right? So again, we see the linkages from the intelligence community, the organized crime, banking, and media. So this Luciano Costello Lansky Siegel alliance was the basis of what subsequently became known as the National Crime Syndicate. Far from the well organized image of the mafia, often promoted by the media, the media, who, as is written in the book, An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood by Neil Gabler, the image of organized crime is not accurate because of who is putting the image out. Since 1936, this emerging crime network took what at first glance appeared to be a major blow following the arrest and successful prosecution of Luciano by Thomas E. Dewey in a spectacular, if not sensational, trial. Luciano's apparent downfall became the assault on New York City's prostitution rackets, which is organization firmly controlled. Uh, Notably, we see that Meyer Lansky didn't go down, but Lucky Luciano did. I wonder why that might be. Dewey's role in this affair is quite interesting because 6 years later, when he ran to secure the presidential nomination for the Republican Party, he joined forces with John Foster Dulles, the brother of Allen Dulles, who is best known for his role as the first civilian head of the CIA in the early years of the Cold War. Dulles, a member of the internationalist camp of American politics that typified the attitudes of the elite Eastern establishment, impressed upon Dewey the importance of overcoming isolationist factions of the Republican Party. What Dulles got in exchange for his steering of Dewey in pursuit of political power, was his own rise to the ranks of the party, ultimately culminating in his service as Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And this is what um, I was alluding to earlier. Even more curious was an investment that Dewey made during the 1950s in an entity called the Mary Carter Paint Company, later named Resorts International. Mary Carter Paint was controlled by the Crosby family, and its operations were overseen by the most practical minded of the family's sons, James Crosby. Mary Carter was deeply tied to organized crime networks. He worked closely in developing businesses in the Bahamas, hand in hand with a number of Meyer Lansky frontmen, while James's brother Peter Crosby was a notorious confidence man with an impressive roster of criminal contacts. It had been widely rumored that Mary Carter was a CIA front company, and if we recall, again, it was through Resorts International, formerly Mary Carter Paint, that Trump purchased his first casino. Okay, so again, we're establishing that Trump is connected to the establishment. Um, and there's probably he's as connected, if not more connected, than anyone who's ever been in office. Going into the OSS, she goes into a history of the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. She's looking in the background of Operation Underworld, which is which has seen the ONI, Office of Navy Intelligence, directly recruit Luciano, was the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime forerunner to the CIA, and America's first robust national intelligence organization. The precise role of the OSS played in the affairs isn't exactly clear. According to George White, a notorious agent of the FBI or the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who had been recruited into the OSS, he had been propositioned by organized crime associate to enlist Luciano in exchange for a pardon, but according to him was a bridge too far. An alliance between the OSS and a person of Luciano's reputation would be a very naive way of doing business. White maintained that he felt it was outrageous to entertain the proposition even for the OSS, who were willing to do almost anything. Um, but Whitney Webb says, in all likelihood, he was lying to protect um, the integrity of the OSS. It goes on to talk about the OSS operated in many different theaters. It wasn't successful in its paramilitary campaign in Europe, but did find success in its operations in the China, Burma, in India theater, where they achieved remarkable results. When it came to spycraft, its supporters gushed with praise, while detractors regarded the tales later woven by its veterans as worthy of skepticism. Um, of note, it says that the OSS was seen as a social club, um, and the importance of that is that there were the people who composed the intelligence agencies, including the OSS, were members of the elite or the Eastern establishment themselves. And so the establishment of intelligence was really meant to be able to support gaining information um, about their commerce enemies, if you will, right? So they wanted initially to gain intelligence information to give them a competitive advantage over their business rivals. Okay, so while the ranks did boast a great many military officers and figures from other government agencies like the FBI and the FBN, its leadership and higher ranking administrative posts tended to be secured by the sons of the country's wealthiest elite. In London, Madrid, Geneva, Paris, and elsewhere, posts were held by members of the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, the family behind the Gulf oil fortune. Heirs of the Morgan family also secured positions within the agency, as did members of the DuPont and Vanderbilt families. Only the Rockefellers were conspicuously absent from the OSS, writes Richard Harris, adding that Nelson Rockefeller headed his own agency, the Coordinator of International Affairs, and David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, also reportedly ran his own intelligence apparatus during the war. So again, the intelligence was helped was meant to facilitate gaining information on their business rivals to give them a competitive advantage, and also to gain insights into what was going on in different countries so that they could be able to exploit expanding their market into these countries, or undermining activities in those countries in order to be able to gain an economic foothold in them. And it says the agency itself was something of a brainchild, at least partially, of William J. Donovan, a prominent New York City antitrust lawyer and veteran of World War One. Along with figures like Dewey and Dulles, Donovan was a consummate Eastern establishment insider. Okay, again, establishing that these people that we're talking about form the establishment which is currently euphemistically referred to as the swamp. That's what we're talking about. So, any suggestion that um, the current president came into office to drain the swamp could nothing could be further from the truth. Donovan was a consummate Eastern establishment insider. He maintained a deep preoccupation with organization and rationalization, which filtered in his work defending trust and the trusts and combines that guided the corporate landscape of his day. He was a firm internationalist when it came to his political outlook. During the interwar years, Donovan had acted as an agent for various corporate interests and had even traveled to Russia on behalf of the Morgans to collect information on the developments of the Bolshevik Revolution, which is what I was alluding to. The intelligence was meant to be able to gather information on business rivals and on countries for which they could be able to use that information to be able to exploit uh, an economic advantage, to be able to make more money, to be able to put in the power of people who are favorable to their interests. And of significance in monitoring the developments of the Bolshevik Revolution, you will recall that the Bolshevik Revolution was carried out primarily by Russian Jews to throw the Tsar in Russia to establish the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. In the course of his wartime intelligence work, Donovan was first appointed by President Roosevelt to head the Office of Coordinator of Information, which was intended to help coordinate the scattered intelligence outfits and military organizations that communicated infrequently and cooperated even less. COI was the seed from which the OSS would later spring. Under Donovan's direction, it became a clearinghouse for military and political propaganda. This was in no small part thanks to Donovan's close friend, a British intelligence operative named William Stevenson. So here you see um, not only linkages between elite businessmen, linkages between organized crime, uh, linkages between Jewish interests, if you will, and also the coordination between all those interests with the British government, um, a significant uh, alliance. Um, and you will recall as well that the founding of the state of Israel was facilitated by a member of the British Parliament, Lord Balfour, who drafted or who put forth the Balfour Agreement, which established the right for Jews to begin to settle in Palestine. And that letter, which precipitated the Balfour Agreement, was written to, or was a correspondence between Balfour and Lord Rothschild, both of whom were members of the Rose Rothschild Secret Society, the Round Table Group. Okay, so I think it's important to be able to establish that link as well, so that we can basically see and connect the dots between what was going on then, who was involved, and how those things have influenced what we see currently unfolding on the world stage. Okay, this individual, Stevenson, was a wartime head of a British intelligence unit in the United States, headquartered in New York City, known as the British Security Coordination. So, British intelligence had a headquarters in New York City, and we've operated under the illusion that the United States was revolted from British rule and control, but British intelligence had headquarters in New York City. He reported to Stuart Menzies, who was then serving as head of MI6. Menzies had tasked Stevenson with establishing a relationship on the highest power possible level between British SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, another name for MI6, and the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stevenson and the BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Center International Building, which is the home of numerous other BSC front organizations. Stevenson also worked closely with other British intelligence agencies, including MI6 itself and the Special Operations Executive, which had begun its life at Section D of MI6. Okay, so you see Rockefeller was also involved in accumulating intelligence, and I'll also point out the fact that the CIA itself was referred to as the company in recognition, euphemistically referred to as the company, because of the fact that much of its intelligence work was for benefited business. In agreement with Menzies' mandate, Stevenson developed a close working relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, who seemed to be enthusiastic about being a liaison to British intelligence on matters concerning the war in Europe. Hoover kept the British in the loop with American reports on German naval movements and the like. But it points out that the relationship between Hoover and Stevenson broke down by 1941, after which Stevenson, again, who was a member of British intelligence, began to cultivate William Donovan, who was part of the OSS, who had a rivalry with J. Edgar Hoover. And so it turns out that Donovan was one of the people who initiated monitoring and getting compromising information on J. Edgar Hoover to neutralize his power and to prevent him from going after organized crime figures. Okay, so again, soon after, Stevenson began to cultivate William Donovan, who increasingly challenged Hoover's position as a sole conduit between the Americans and the British. When Donovan was appointed by Roosevelt as the coordinator of information and subsequently formed the OSS, an intense bureaucratic struggle erupted between Hoover and his rivals. As will be discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, the struggle allegedly led Donovan to coordinate with organized crime kingpins, namely Meyer Lansky, to blackmail Hoover in an effort to bring him to heel. Stevenson did more than simply cultivate Donovan. In 1940, he reported back to his handlers that there is no doubt we can achieve infinitely more through Donovan than through any other individual. He is very receptive and can be trusted to represent our needs in the right quarters in the right way in the USA. Okay. And so we see that the British government was uh, exercising a great deal of influence and control over U.S. politics through their contacts and relationships with the United States intelligence community, who again were linked with political interests, and for that matter, um, the accumulation of intelligence on political figures gave them the ability to be able to exert control and influence over them. Okay, it says Donovan conferred closely with Robert Sherwood, a playwright, ardent interventionist, and close confidant of President Roosevelt. Says that Thomas Mall wrote Sherman sent Donovan a list of people he thought he could trust for the work we discussed yesterday evening at your home. Um, at the time, Sherwood was working closely with the BSC, even sending them copies of speeches he had written for the president prior to Roosevelt receiving them. As efforts were undertaken to get the American intelligence apparatus up and running, the BSC undertook a propaganda campaign aimed at garnering support for such an institution. Modeling this book, Desperate Deception, shows how BSC assets seeded the idea throughout the mass media, which in turn was circulated up to the heights of political power. Okay, again, when we understand who the mass media was and who it was controlled by, you see who we're talking about and who is basically wielding um, the power. And we see what the alliances are. Okay. In a meeting, it says, one characteristic incident took place in May 1941, just a month prior to Donovan's meeting with Sherwood. It was on May 9th that Vincent Astor of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's friend and New York area coordinator of intelligence, sent the president a clipping from the New York Herald Tribune that was probably a plant to build consensus for voices calling for the plan British intelligence wanted. The Herald Tribune was BSA's favorite outlet for planted articles. Moreover, the putative author, George Fielding Eliot, was a devoted British sympathizer, one of the most influential people in the BSE front fight for freedom, and a favorite vehicle for planted articles. Okay, Brother Steve Coakley pointed out to us how to identify uh, articles that had been planted in the manner that is suggested here in the book. It's citing the threat from fifth columnists and enemy agents. Elliott pointed out with alarm at the lack of coordinator for the FBI, ONI, and G2 intelligence. And so you see the British exerting influence over policy in the United States um, through its coordination with United States intelligence agencies. And again, I would suggest that the hidden hand between both of those are the Zionist interests who not only controlled and had influence over the American intelligence and government, but also exerted a significant influence on the British government. Okay, now when we talk about the fifth column is the media, and a I guess an important asset in terms of being able to shape um, political policy. Okay, so the idea of the fifth column, which would represent the American media, was a prime component of BSE propaganda, so British intelligence propaganda, and would later be adopted by the OSS itself. It was used to attack isolationist holdouts against American entry into the war. So it used the media basically to influence the um, influence political interests and public opinion to um, garner support for the United States entering into World War II. It was also used to generate fear and create an atmosphere of distrust amongst the general public. The term originated during the course of the early phase of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s and was used to describe something like a domestic military in waiting. The fifth column was purported to be composed of enemy agents and their sympathizers with a mandate towards sabotage and other violent activities. According to Maul, one of the strongest promoters of the notion of a Nazi fifth column active in America was a Chicago journalist and close associate of Donovan named Edgar Ansel Mower, who was subsequently identified as an asset of British intelligence. Okay. I think we'll leave it there for now, and we'll pick this up next time. But um, I found reading this chapter very informative, and it puts in perspective things that are going on that went on leading up to what's happening today. And as you can see here, as I forwarded through the chapter here, uh, it establishes these connections that go back to the 1940s, the beginning of World War II, bringing it up to current times where it says here, after the war came to an end, Tony Keswick returned to the world of corporate affairs, taking up a position running one of the family's correspondent companies in London. He also served for a time as government of Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. As discussed in the next chapter, Hudson's Bay Company was central to the rise of the Bronfman family that have long straddled the murky line between legitimate corporate enterprises and the criminal underworld. In turn, the Bronfmans, as will be illustrated at length in this book, will be an important would be important to the rise of the network that later enabled the illicit activities of one Jeffrey Epstein. So we'll leave it there for now, and we'll pick this up next time. But before we go, um, one of the things I do want to point out is that this is part of the human the human drama, and the cycle of time that we're in uh, is is a dark period, and during those dark periods, the darker forces of humanity are, are in control and wish to be able to maintain control. And so, during when we are in these dark periods, it is more important for us to be able to be spiritually grounded so that we do not fall victim to um, the dark influences over our lives and using those things to be able to control and manipulate us. So, and that's why so much effort has been exerted to um, distract people from being in tune with their spiritual selves, to be able to um, empower themselves spiritually. Because once one is grounded in spirituality, uh, you don't have the same level of fear, because when we get in tune with our spiritual self, we become empowered. And one of our listeners tonight says the media and the intelligence community have always partnered up, and I didn't know that organized crime played a role in this. Yeah, that's I knew it. I didn't know it to the level of significance that Whitney Webb is outlining in her book. And just to again point out that the book that we're reviewing is Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, and we're in volume one, in chapter one. And I highly recommend that you get this book because it's extremely informative. All right, so we'll leave it there, and we'll pick it up where we left off, and I'll continue reading it so that I can maybe you know uh, summarize it, um, because it's a pretty extensive book, and it's going to take us a lot of time to get through it, particularly if I'm reading it. But um, as I read it, I'll be able to like just point out some of the key things that need to be brought forward. But I think it's really important to go back into this history in order to be able to gain a more accurate understanding of what's unfolding before us, and who the players are, uh, what the objectives are, and to really be able to understand the linkages between all these organizations and the common threads between them all. So, you know, it's we're spirit people, we're spirit beings living a human existence, and spirituality is meant to give us the tools and means to be able to navigate this human drama more effectively without getting caught up in it, uh, and basically um, being victimized by it. Right. So with that, we'll leave it there. We'll see you again here on Journey into Self. Um, Likely 2 weeks from now, we'll go back live. So thank you for tuning in. We found it informative. And we'll see you next time here on Journey into Self.